In today's video, I'm discussing chapters 8 and 9 of No Man Knows My History. Welcome back to Candlewick Library. Today I'm discussing Fawn Brodie's No Man Knows My History, chapters 8 and 9. Similar to the last video, these two chapters and the next two I'll be doing don't have quite as much, there's not quite as many things that I'm going to be going into in depth with. And so I'm just going to be doing an overview of what is happening during this time period. And that way I'll be able to walk through more chapters quicker. All right, so I'm going to start with chapter 8, Temple Builder. When I left off in the last video, I was talking about how Joseph had started to fill the pool toward Independence, Missouri, and they have members going there now. And how he has stated that a lot of the miracles that aren't working are because Independence is Zion, and the miracles aren't going to work in Kirtland because it's unhallowed ground. So that's where we're going to start off. It was 250 miles to Independence from St. Louis, where Joseph left the luxury of the steamboat and began to walk. She writes that at the beginning of the journey, they were buoyed up by extravagant hopes, some predicting mass conversions of the Indians through the gift of tongues, and all chanting the refrain, "We shall winter in Ohio, but one winter more." So they really had a positive idea of what was going to be happening in Independence. So Independence was a hub back then. It was right there at the end of the territory. It was a place where it wasn't a huge bustling town yet, but there was a lot going on there. They were starting to build something there. As she writes, Independence, however, proved to be the crudest kind of frontier village with little more than a dozen log houses, 3 stores, a schoolhouse, and a brick courthouse. The Mormon colony consisted of 3 or 4 females. Joseph was dismayed by Cowdery's ineptness as a missionary, but failed at first to sense the shock and bewilderment that swept over his men. He could see, though, why it was a key town in the frontier. Joseph was really good at picking up on things like that, and he could see the potential. She describes how he's standing on a hill, and he's basically there at the end of this, wild frontier in front of him. The way she puts it is, he was standing, it seemed, on the last big hill between the Indian border and the peaks of the Rocky Mountains hundreds of miles west. As he looked at this land and kind of saw what it might become, he decided that this is where he was going to build a temple. So, she goes on to say that when the recently dispossessed New York colony arrived, he settled them on the low land between Independence and the Indian border, the first cabin rising in what is now the heart of Kansas City. The temple site was dedicated in a simple but moving ceremony, with the cornerstone laid at the foot of a sapling whose vigor and promise symbolized the future of the church. But he started to have some problems here in Missouri as well, even with it being so small. Edward Partridge was put in charge of the United Order. And we talked about the United Order last week that was where everybody gave everything they owned to the church, and the church would be in charge of giving it out to the members. Edward Partridge was put in charge of that United Order in Missouri. And he complained about the quality of the land that Joseph was purchasing. When Joseph replied with some heat that heaven had selected the land, Partridge replied pointedly, "I wish you not to tell us any more that you know these things by the Spirit, when you do not. You told us that Oliver had raised up a large church here, and there is no such thing." So Joseph then told him very calmly, though, "I see it." And once again, everybody is supposed to just trust in him. When they're looking around and saying, okay, well, this isn't what you said it was going to be in Missouri. But he's like, well, I see it. It's going to happen. And so then they have to kind of sit back. Okay, am I going to trust him or not? A man named Ezra Booth, from this point on, held a lot of suspicion toward Joseph. According to Ezra Booth, Rigdon was particularly annoyed with Joseph, telling him bluntly that his vision was a bad thing and urging him to immediately return to Ohio. So Joseph became torn then between 2 of his biggest key men, Sidney Rigdon, who wanted to stay with Kirtland, and Oliver Cowdery. And so Oliver Cowdery lost out, and Joseph agreed to return to Ohio. She writes, the Mormons were thus split in 2, the Missouri colony becoming a haven for the disinherited, and the Kirtland church retaining the prestige of the prophet's presence. So then they started, setting up more things. They set up a printing press in Independence to publish the Evening Morning Star, and everything was still left in Edward Partridge's hands to be in charge of. Back in Kirtland, in October of 1831, the United Order there began to finally make some headway because Joseph was given a $10,000 loan from Charles Holmes. With this, Newell K. Whitney was made bishop, and his store became the new storehouse and commissary. And new revelation suggested that if debts accumulated, the account was to be handed over to the Bishop of Zion, who should pay the debt out of that which the Lord shall put in his hands. The interesting thing about that loan, that $10,000 loan from Charles Holmes, is that she has a footnote about it that you can go and you can, research more, but this is the footnote. The record of this loan is in the Chardon, Ohio courthouse. Along with several others, Joseph Smith signed 2 notes on October 5th, 1831, each for $5,000. The first payable on May 1st, 1837, and the second on September 1st, 1837. On October 15th, 1831, he borrowed $200 more from Holmes. In April 1838, Holmes sued Joseph Smith for the $15,000. Apparently, they were never paid, and Smith lost the case by default, but by that date, he'd left Kirtland forever. So Holmes was planning on that only being a loan, not a I'm giving my money to the church, and he never got it back. At this point, Joseph has put so many men in places of charge of different business transactions, and he's kind of left the business to them, and he's going to now work on a new translation of the Bible. He had moved to Hiram, about 40 miles southeast of Kirtland, accepting the hospitality of John Johnson. This is going to become important. Okay, remember that he is living with the Johnson family in Hiram right now. The Bible revision was tedious, but the discipline had an enduring effect upon Joseph's thinking and style. Here was no careless spinning of loose-jointed sentences. It was meticulous. It taught him for the first time the value of the word. He modernized many sentences and made occasional changes in doctrine. But the most interesting parts of Joseph's Bible were the interpolations concerning himself and the Mormon Zion. He could not resist the temptation to insert in the book of Genesis a prophecy of his own coming. Joseph, son of Jacob, was made to say, Thus saith the Lord God of my fathers, unto me a choice seer will I raise up out of the fruit of thy loins, and he shall be esteemed highly among the fruit of thy loins, and his name shall be called Joseph, and it shall be after the name of his father. And that's something I've spoken about on here before, of that Genesis, how he elongated the end of Genesis to include himself. Then he elaborated the prophecy of Isaiah concerning the learned man in the sealed book, which had so impressed Martin Harris after his return from the visit to Charles Anton. We talked about that a few videos ago, enlarging it with such fidelity to the details of the New York episode that it must have astonished even Harris. This prophecy of Isaiah was also made to include references to the Book of Mormon witnesses and the return of the golden plates to the Lord. What's interesting is that he would have a lot of revelations come during this time. That amped up a lot, but a lot of them would come as a direct result of him being in the Bible. And so she gives a couple of examples, like Paul's first epistle to the Corinthians, containing the 3 verses that say there are also celestial bodies and bodies terrestrial, but the glory of the celestial is one and the glory of the terrestrial is another. There is one glory of the sun and another glory of the moon and another glory of the stars. For one star differeth from another star in glory, so also is the resurrection of the dead. So he took that, and that is where he was able to have his vision of a resurrection in which there were 3 kingdoms of glory. The celestial kingdom, which would be the glory of the sun and the highest one for members of the church that are doing everything they're supposed to do. And then the terrestrial with the glory of the moon for those that never knew the gospel. And then he coined the word telestial for a 3rd kingdom whose glory was to be that of the stars, to be peopled with those who refused the law of God. What's funny is it's very different from the resurrection of fire and brimstone in the Book of Mormon, but you can see how his theology changes as he goes along. That's why I mentioned that when people say the Book of Mormon holds the fullness of the gospel, and I said, but most of the core doctrine of Mormonism is not in the Book of Mormon. It came during this time, from here and into Nauvoo. The other thing that's interesting to note here is to stop and think about his Bible translation. Because when I was a member, is that I believed that his translation of the Bible was just him. It was just him. It was inspired from God. And in fact, the LDS website says it is a revision or translation of the King James Version of the Bible begun by the prophet Joseph Smith in June 1830. He was divinely commissioned to make the translation and regarded it as a branch of his calling as a prophet. Although the major portion of the work was completed by July 1833, he continued to make modifications while preparing a manuscript for the press until his death in 1844. And it is possible that some additional modifications would have been made had he lived to publish the entire work. Some parts of the translation were published during his lifetime. That's from LDS.org. And on LDS Discussions, they have a link to the Ensign magazine in 1972 that says, the process was described in an Ensign article to say that it appears that the work was to be a revelatory experience through which Joseph would come to an understanding of things that he had not previously known. In the LDS Church, you're taught to believe in the Bible as long as it's translated correctly, and there is a lot of emphasis put on that. And Apostle John A. Widtsoe had said that because of that, it was the fact that Joseph could translate the Bible correctly, some of the places that have been messed up, apparently, that it was a remarkable evidence of his prophetic power. Bruce R. McConkie of the 70 said that his inspired version of the Bible is one of the great evidences of the divine mission of Joseph Smith. Bruce R. McConkie in 1984 also stated that the Joseph Smith translation or inspired version is 1,000 times over the best Bible now existing on earth, and it will give anyone who has spiritual insight a deep appreciation of this revelatory work of the prophet Joseph Smith. But just like most of the things that have to do with Joseph Smith, recent studies have brought some new things into light. So we are taught to believe that his translation of the Bible was also inspiration from God through Joseph Smith, the same way some of his other translations are supposed to be. But there was a recent study at BYU, and through this study, they found that the Smith family had a readily available Bible commentary that was a mainstay for Methodist theologians. We know that his family, they were very connected with the Methodist Church at this time. It was one of the most widely available commentaries in the mid-1820s to 1830s in America. It was called the Adam Clarke Bible Commentary. They have discovered that the Smith family would have had access to the Adam Clarke Bible Commentary. This is a quote from the study. Our research has revealed that the number of direct parallels between Smith's translation and Adam Clarke's biblical commentary are simply too numerous and explicit to posit happenstance or coincidental overlap. The parallels between the two texts number in the hundreds, a number that is well beyond the limits of this paper to discuss. A few of them, however, demonstrate Smith's open reliance upon Clarke and establish that he was inclined to lean on Clarke's commentary for matters of history, textual questions, clarifications of wording, and theological nuance. In presenting the evidence, we have attempted to both establish that Smith drew upon Clarke, likely at the urging of Rigdon, and we present here a broad categorization of the type of changes Smith made when he used Clarke as a source. So it was a student and a professor that did this study together, and they have said that just speaking in terms of direct engagement, Joseph Smith plagiarized Clarke about 30 times in his New Testament translation, a little less in the Old Testament, but there's about 10 parallels, 15 direct parallels in the Old Testament. There's a lot, and these aren't just like one word here and there. These were whole sentences. So you can go and you can learn more about this whole study, but I find it very interesting because you're not taught that he had any kind of commentary that he used for his Bible translation. He basically was plagiarizing someone else's commentary to make the Joseph Smith translation. And that was something I did not know until just about a year and a half ago. And I went and watched a whole video about the study, so if you're interested in it more, you can find things like that. But it'd be a little bit too much to go into the whole thing here. But his translation of the Bible is not something that he came up with 100% on his own. We talked about how there's a few people that are becoming disenchanted with Joseph. Simon Ryder left the church because a special revelation on his behalf misspelled his name. Ezra Booth had been out of church for some months, disillusioned by what he called Joseph's habitual proneness to jesting and joking. And he was convinced by the trip to Missouri that all of Joseph's revelations sprang out of mundane crisis rather than promptings of the Lord. I think as I go along that most of us can start picking up that pattern. Ezra Booth wasn't wrong there. Almost every time Joseph has a revelation, it comes in response to something that he doesn't know how to get out of, or that he wants to convince somebody of. At this point, the two babies that Joseph and Emma had adopted contracted the measles. This is another really sad part in their life. Word came that there was a rebellion brewing in Missouri, and Joseph realized that only a personal visit to independence would prevent serious apostasy. With the news going through the town, a gang of Mormon baiters led by Simon Ryder, the one who didn't like his name being misspelled, was determined to hasten the departure of Joseph. They were drunk. They smashed their way into the Johnson home on the night of March 24th, 1832, and dragged Joseph from the trundle bed where he had fallen asleep while watching one of the twins. They stripped him, scratched and beat him with savage pleasure, and smeared his bleeding body with tar from head to foot. Ripping a pillow into shreds, they plastered him with feathers. There's also speculation that he was going to be castrated, and they had a doctor there with them to castrate Joseph Smith, but the doctor chose not to in the end. When it came time to do it, he chose not to. This is an extremely sad story, and it is not okay that they did this to him. However, there is more to the story than I ever heard. So, they take him out of the house, they tar and feather him, they're beating him, they're hurting him, they're being horrible. They're doing things they shouldn't be doing. One of the men is Eli Johnson. From records other than the LDS Church record, where you just get the story of what they did to him, you find out that the reason that he gives for this happening was that Joseph was being too intimate with his sister. And this is the family that Joseph lived with. This is the Johnsons. So his sister, Nancy Miranda, Eli said that Joseph is taking advantage of her, that he's been too intimate with her, and that is why they are doing this to him. I don't think that's probably the only reason, but I do think it's a reason, and I actually do think that it was happening, and this is why. Nancy Miranda would later become one of Joseph's wives. And that is not something I'd ever heard in connection with this story. I didn't know. You hear about the mobs doing things, and this will actually come into play later with his death as well, that there are a lot of rumors of who was in the mob that wanted him dead and why. And it's not always cut and dry. There were definitely a lot of people that wanted him to suffer and wanted other Mormons that were innocent to suffer and would do anything, no matter how evil and mean, to see them suffer. But there also were some people that feel like they really had a reason to hate him more than the average person. And I think we have to make sure we're not condoning that. We're not justifying what they did because of it. And yet, I think it's really important that people know the whole story and don't just think, oh, these people they got drunk, this guy was mad, so they came and got him out, they tarred and feathered him, and that's the end of the story. Joseph was able to use this experience also to further bolster his reputation with people who might have started to question him a little bit, because he spent the whole night getting all of this, scraped off of him, and it would have been excruciating what he went through and then what he went through to get it off of him. And then he still got up and preached the next day. Sadly, 5 days later, one of those twins died from the measles. I've heard people say that it was probably a direct result of this, affecting the family's emotions, affecting maybe the coldness of the house if the door was left open. I don't know if any of that's true, but either way, it is so sad that the little baby died. So at this point, of course, the Smiths choose to leave Hiram for good and go back to Kirtland. And then Joseph starts for independence with Sidney Rigdon. In Missouri, the people there are very jealous of Kirtland, the treatment that they're getting, that Joseph is there. The people in Kirtland have all the key positions in the government of the church. And so when Joseph arrives, one of his biggest things to do is to make sure that he is relieving the major tensions in Missouri. They've had phenomenal growth there during this time. And in fact, when he returned to Ohio in May 1832, he left 300 converts in Missouri. But this number had doubled in a single year. But the colony was poor, and their provisions were scarce. Our food, wrote Parley Pratt in his autobiography, consisted of beef and a little bread made of corn, which had been grated into coarse meal by rubbing the ears on a tin grater. But such provision heightened the sense of kinship and oneness with God. When you realize that the people in Kirtland have a lot of land, and they've got a lot of provisions, and then these people in Missouri are basically starving, you do see the huge difference between the two groups of Mormons now. She talks about how in Missouri, unfortunately, the United Order isn't working as well because most of the people that are coming in do not have money to give. And some people are joining and don't want to join the United Order. They don't want to give up their things. So Joseph makes a new rule there that if you don't join the United Order, you cannot join the church. Nothing was so dangerous to the order in Missouri as apostasy, for when a man left the church and was refused the return of his property, he promptly went to the courts. So in the last video, I said how if they left the church, their stuff would still stay property of the church. But here in Missouri, since the courts and the people in charge are not friendly to Mormons, that's not going to hold up in court. Resentment is building in Missouri because they really feel like Joseph is favoring Kirtland. And so he gets a revelation and says, I say unto your brethren in Zion in love greeting that I have called you also to preside over Zion in mine own due time. Therefore let them cease wearying me concerning this matter. At this point, Joseph has decided Kirtland needs to remain the center of the church. Missouri is not working out the way he wants it to at this point. Emma has a son during this time, and then also Joseph goes to New York during this time. He makes a trip to New York to negotiate some loans for the Kirtland United Order. In the book, she has a copy of a letter that Joseph wrote Emma from New York. And I find this interesting because I spoke a few videos ago about how Emma said that Joseph couldn't even put a letter together. And I want to read this letter. My dear wife, this day I have been walking through the most splendid part of the city of New York. The buildings are truly great and wonderful to the astonishing of every beholder, and the language of my heart is like this. Can the great God of all the earth, maker of all things magnificent and splendid, be displeased with man for all these great inventions sought out by them? My answer is no, it cannot be, seeing these great works are calculated to make men comfortable, wise, and happy. Therefore, not for these works can the Lord be displeased. Only against man is the anger of the Lord kindled, because they give him not the glory. Therefore, their iniquity shall be visited upon their heads, and their works shall be burned up with unquenchable fire. Oh, how long, O Lord, shall this order of things exist, and darkness cover the earth, and gross darkness cover the people? After beholding all that I had any desire to behold, I returned to my room to meditate and calm my mind, and behold, the thoughtful home of Emma and Julia rushes upon my mind like a flood, and I could wish for a moment to be with them. My breast so fills with all the feelings and tenderness of a parent and husband, and could I be with you, I would tell you many things. Yet when I set foot upon this great city like Nineveh, my bowels is filled with compassion toward them. I prefer reading and praying and holding a communion with the Holy Spirit and writing to you than walking the streets and beholding the distractions of men. Your affectionate husband until death, Joseph Smith, Jr. The original of this letter is in the library of the Reorganized Church, and it is one of the few things he wrote that he didn't have dictated. And that shows you what I said earlier in another video of the fact that I don't trust it when people say he couldn't put words together. At this point in the chapter, she talks about how Joseph and his brothers, they were all tall and well-built, and they were quite the sight walking around together. There was something in their manner and appearance that was bewitching and winning, John D. Lee recalled a few years later. So I think a lot of people looked at the Smiths and they really did felt drawn to them. By this time, Joseph had secured a house and a beautiful 140-acre farm. Again, think about how the Missourians are doing, and then he's got this 140-acre farm. About that, E.D. Howe wrote, "Thus it is that these self-made prophets and high priests are acquiring possessions of real estate in a rich and flourishing country while their dupes are packed off to the wilds of Missouri." And I'm sure a lot of them felt that way. She also then tells us about how in November 1832, Joseph is out chopping wood when his friends bring by a new convert, and he's introduced as Brigham Young. He asked Brigham to pray. Brigham fell into gifts of tongues, and that was something that Joseph at this point had tried to suppress a little bit, but he didn't do that with Brigham. He told everybody that Brigham was speaking the true Adamic language. This is where their friendship begins. Brigham Young would later then become the second prophet of the mainstream LDS Church. And then during this time, Joseph really began to work on the Kirtland Temple. I find it really interesting that he at first is like, nope, this is unhallowed ground, we got to go to Missouri, and then, oh, never mind, we're building a temple here, and we have to stay here because now we're going to have good things happen here. Joseph began in the spring of 1833 an active campaign for the building of a temple in Kirtland. A revelation setting the dimensions at 55 by 65 feet and calling for 3 stories promised a somewhat more imposing structure than the usual frontier church. In the beginning, he dared not call it a temple because he had already dedicated the land for the temple in Zion, but he could kindle little enthusiasm for a house and school despite 3 provocative revelations on the subject. It required the promise of a great and mysterious endowment to induce the subscription of enough money even to lay the foundation. As he was laying the foundation for this temple, he began to plan a city of 12 temples. He blocked out the city in squares of uniform size, divided by phenomenally wide streets, with schools and temples placed at regular intervals. This city, he said, should contain between 15 to 20,000 citizens, with each man living in his own brick or stone house, set back from the street, and some garden. Barns and stables were to be kept outside the city on surrounding farms. And Brigham Young would use these plans later for Salt Lake City. A week after laying the cornerstone for this temple, he ordered the building of the temple in Missouri. A revelation on August 2nd, 1833, commanded his people there to give a tithe of all their property to start the temple fund, the Lord promising that if it was done, Zion would become very glorious, very great, and very terrible, with the nations of the earth honoring her. But if she observe not, I will visit her according to all her works with sore affliction, with pestilence, with plague, with sword, with vengeance, with devouring fire. Nevertheless, let it be read this one to her ears, that I, the Lord, have accepted of her offering, and if she sin no more, none of these things shall come upon her. Joseph is saying, okay, now we're going to be building a temple in Zion as well. You're going to give all your tithes. You got to give all this money so you don't get destroyed. What he doesn't realize at this point is, as she says, Zion had already been struck with sword and vengeance and devouring fire. Exactly a fortnight earlier, a mob had stormed into Independence, burned the printing house, smashed the press, carried off the newly printed collections of Revelations, tarred and feathered Bishop Partridge, and ordered the whole colony to leave the country. So it's very poor timed revelation. She doesn't go too much into what happened there in Missouri with that, with the burning down of the printing press and where the Book of Commandments were being printed. But in the Saints book that I have used on here before, they do go into that, of course. It's a very well-known story that there were 2 young girls that were crouched together beside a nearby fence. 15-year-old Mary Elizabeth Rollins and her 13-year-old sister Caroline watched as the men scattered the pages of the Book of Commandments. So they decided to try to save them, and they grabbed as many pages as they could and ran into a cornfield, and these men chased them, and the girls hid with the pages in the field. I've heard that story so many times. What I never heard was that the 15-year-old would later become one of Joseph's wives. And they don't tell you that here in Saints either when they're telling you the story. They also talk about Emily Partridge and how she's 9 years old and rushing out to see what's happening. And they also don't tell you that she's going to become one of his wives. So things are not looking good in Missouri. So chapter 9 goes on, expulsion from Eden. Few episodes in American religious history parallel the barbarism of the anti-Mormon persecutions. That the town in which these began should bear the name of Independence only accentuates the tragic irony of the case. And that's so true. So she's going into this of how the reason that the Missourians didn't want them there. And there's a lot of reasons they didn't want the Mormons there. None of those justified their actions, but these are some of the reasons she gives. Part of the problem is that they knew that these Mormons weren't coming in and move on if there were new territories open. But they were saying, we are here until the millennium. We are here for good. And so they knew it was a permanent problem if they didn't do something about it. A lot of the men that lived in this area were tradesmen and real estate speculators and professional gamblers and people that had a real resentment toward the kind of people that were coming in. One of the main reasons was the political implications. And she quotes that in here. "The day is not far distant," they complained, "when the sheriff, the justices, and the county judges will be Mormons or persons wishing to court their favor from motives of interest or ambition. What would be the fate of our lives and property in the hands of jurors and witnesses who do not blush to declare and would not upon occasion hesitate to swear that they have wrought miracles, and have been the subject of miraculous supernatural cures, have conversed with God and his angels, and possess and exercise the gifts of divination and unknown tongues, and fired with the prospect of obtaining inheritances without money and without price may better be imagined than described. We are daily told," the settlers said, "and not by the ignorant alone, but by all classes of them, that we, the Gentiles of this county, are to be cut off, and our lands appropriated by them for inheritances. Whether this is to be accomplished by the hand of the destroying angel, the judgments of God, or the arm of power, they are not fully agreed upon among themselves." At this point, you kind of put yourself in their place of, all of a sudden, they've got a hold on this place, and all of a sudden all these people are coming in, and they realize that if these people come in, there's going to be so many of them, that they're going to completely take over the government. And there is some truth to that. I mean, all you have to do is look at the politics of Salt Lake City to realize there's truth to that. I think that they had a point. But also, if they have people telling them, hey, your land's gonna be our land eventually, because God wants us to have this, it's our promised land, I can see where that would be really threatening as well. Another reason that they gave was that they wanted to convert Indians. Another reason is that a lot of them were Northerners that were anti-slavery. And that probably was one of the biggest problems. What's interesting about that is because of that, I always thought that there was no slavery in the LDS Church, but I have since found that there were slaves in Salt Lake City when they first came in, that in fact the first people into the valley were slaves. And so that really bothers me when I hear people say, oh, they were totally anti-slavery. I think a lot of them were, but not all of them. So at this point, W. Phelps wrote up a manifesto about slavery and it made the Missourians think that he was inviting them there, all of the freed slaves from other places and everybody to come there. And so they wrote up a manifesto demanding the expulsion of Mormons. And this was signed by the county officers and judges and clerks. And so at this point, they have the opposite problem of what they're afraid of. They're afraid the Mormons are going to come in and take over everything. But at this point, they have control of everything. So the Mormons don't have a fair trial. Phelps realized his mistake and re-established a new manifesto where he said, in part, having learned with extreme regret that an article entitled Free People of Color in the last number of the Star has been misunderstood, we feel in duty bound to state in this extra that our intention was not only to stop free people of color from immigrating to the state, but to prevent them from being admitted as members of the church. I found that in the Saints book, when it talks about this part, they only tell you two reasons that they didn't want them there. They tell you the Indians and the slavery problem, the two that make the Mormons look good. And they left out a lot of the other things. But I do think that the slavery thing was probably one of the biggest reasons. The Missourians ignored this recantation of W. Phelps, and 500 settlers met in Independence and drew up 5 demands. First, that no Mormons settle in Jackson County in the future. Second, that those already settled promise to sell their lands and leave. Third, that the Mormon press, storehouse, and shops close immediately. And fourth, that the leaders stop all immigration from Ohio. The fifth demand was a not too cryptic direction that those who fail to comply with these requisitions be referred to those of their brethren who have the gifts of divination and of unknown tongues to inform them of the lot that waits them. Partridge was given only 15 minutes to make a decision after this. And so then that's when they went in and ransacked everything and took and smashed the printing press and did all the things. The women and children that night fled into the forest, and thus started a pattern of these Missourians really persecuting these Missouri Mormons, and the women and children having to hide, and all of their things being ruined and destroyed. Oliver Cowdery brought this news to Joseph that this was happening. An immediate revelation ordered them to renounce war and proclaim peace and to bear all indignities with patience. I can't imagine if you were going through this and you think that your prophet is a real prophet of God, speaking for God, and he's like, okay, don't fight back, bear this with patience. He delegated 2 men to petition the governor of Missouri, and unofficially he suggested that Zion had brought down the calamity upon herself. I am not at all astonished, he wrote on September 4th to Vienna Jacques, at what has happened to you, neither to what has happened to Zion. And I could tell you the whys and wherefores of all these calamities, but alas, it is in vain to warn and give precepts, for all men are naturally disposed to walk in their own paths as they are pointed out by their own fingers, and are not willing to consider and walk in the path which is pointed out by another, although he should be an unerring director, and the Lord his God sent him. Vienna, that he wrote this to, was a bachelor woman with a modest capital of $1,400, and had been ordered to Zion by a personal revelation from Joseph, which had commanded her to take only enough money for expenses and to consecrate the remainder to the Lord. In return for her faithfulness, she had been promised an inheritance and independence. To comfort her now, Joseph concluded his letter with a prayer and promise, O Lord, let Zion be comforted. Let her waste places be built up and established 100-fold. Let thy handmaid live till her soul shall be satisfied in beholding the glory of Zion. For notwithstanding her present affliction, she shall yet arise and put on her beautiful garments and be the joy and the glory of the whole earth. Therefore let your heart be comforted. I will assure you that the Lord has respect unto the offering you make. So it's bad enough what these Missouri Mormons are going through, but now Joseph has also said it's their fault. And he's left on a preaching tour through Canada and the East, and basically left them up to their fate. There's nothing he can do. He knows that there's nothing he can do. He suggested to those that in Missouri who were in the greatest danger that they leave Jackson County, but advised the remainders to wait until the animosity had died down before taking any action. Cowdery was sent off to New York to buy a new printing press, promising that if he set it up in Kirtland, he would be the new editor. So following his advice, the Missouri converts turned the other cheek, and their only action in self-defense was a vigorous petition to the governor, asking for troops to maintain order. Governor Dunklin expressed warm sympathy, but postponed the action by advising the Mormons to appeal to their local judges first, which we know are not going to be fair. The church leaders and independents did find 4 lawyers. The following night, on October 31st, 50 men attacked an outlying Mormon colony west of Big Blue River, unroofed and partly demolished 10 cabins, whipped and stoned the men, and drove the women and children shrieking into the woods again. At this point, this happens for subsequent nights, and the Mormons begin to organize themselves for defense. They start patrolling their own settlements. David Whitmer leads one, and they clashed with some marauders on November 4th, and some non-Mormons and Mormons were killed. So Lieutenant Governor of the state, Boggs, was living in Independence at the time, called out the militia to restore order. He placed at the head of the militia a Colonel Thomas Pitcher, who had been one of the signers of the manifesto against the Mormons, asking them to leave. Hearing that their imprisoned brethren were about to be shot, the Mormons gathered in force just west of Independence, and here they were approached by Colonel Pitcher, who demanded the surrender of their arms and insisted that several men give themselves up to be tried for the murder of the 2 Missourians that had been slain. Boggs personally urged the Mormons to obey, and they did. He also suggested that Pitcher also disarm the Missourians, but of course he didn't. That night, they systematically attacked the Mormon settlers again in each Mormon community, beat and whipped the men, and drove the women and children out like cattle. Before morning, 1,200 people had been herded forth in the teeth of a November gale. This brutality actually got them their first supporters outside of the church. The Missouri press almost universally deplored the outrage, and newspapers throughout the nation reprinted the details with indignant editorial comment. So the lawyers retained by the Mormons now threw caution aside and fought honestly for their clients' rights. And for the first time, Governor Dunklin gave them right to organize into militia groups for their own protection. Although some of the exiles now moved on into surrounding counties, the bulk of the Mormons remained bivouacked on the Missouri bottoms, hopefully waiting for word from their prophet. It took exactly 1 month for the news of their banishment to reach him. He received letters from Phelps and Hyde that were fairly accurate, but on the same day, a courier brought him a fantastic story of a battle in which the Mormons had killed more than 20 Missourians. So Joseph sends him a letter, and in it he says, "It will be impossible for us to render you any temporal assistance, as our means are already exhausted and we are deeply in debt, and know of no means whereby we shall be able to extricate ourselves." 11 days later, a new revelation officially explained the curse that had descended over Zion. "I, the Lord, have suffered the affliction to come upon them, wherewith they have been afflicted in consequence of their transgressions. Behold, I say unto you, there were jarrings and contentions and envyings and strifes and lustful and covetous desires among them. Therefore, by these things they polluted their inheritance." Phelps had been aware of this attitude in the prophet before he saw the revelation, for he had written on December 15th a despairing letter that reflected the bewilderment of every devout man who had seen the innocent suffer along with the godless. Most of the Mormons now are settled in Clay County, where some people have decided to give them temporary shelter. But Joseph has forbidden them to sell their property. He sent a petition to Andrew Jackson that actually threatened him, but he probably never saw it, and some secretaries sent it back to them and politely informed the prophet his proper recourse was to apply to the authorities of Missouri. So obviously the order has completely collapsed in independence. On April 10th, 1834, the Kirtland Council dissolved their order as well. Dividing the community property was a thorny business. They need to figure out what to do with all the property in this Kirtland United Order. So Joseph deeds himself the temple lot, Rigdon the tannery, Cowdery the printing shop, and most of the other leaders the lots on which they were living. But in 1835, when the time came to print this doling out of property, he substituted fictitious names to avoid any unpleasantness. Ahashada for Whitney, Olaha for Cowdery, Pelagorum for Rigdon, Mahemson for Harris, and Gazelem for himself. He even used code names for the industries, Laneshine House for the printing shop, and Ozanda for the store. So Rigdon really wanted him to try to revise the United Order and try it again, but Joseph made only one effort to revive it in 1834. It collapsed near the end of the year again. So this was just not one of those ideas that lasted. So as we can see, once again, Joseph has tried something that has been a complete failure, but he won't get blamed for it. And he has watched the Missouri Mormons go through the worst persecution, and the Missourians are being left to their own devices and told that they caused it. And once again, that is something that is going to pervade the church from the beginning to now, of causing the misfortunes that you go through, whether you did or not. I think her final line of this chapter sums up this video perfectly, and the idea behind these two chapters. Joseph's kingdom, unlike that of Jesus, was unmistakably of this world.